I'm excited to be here. My name is Will Miller. I'm the Associate Vice President for Continuous Improvement and Institutional Performance at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. If you're not familiar with Riddle, we specialize in aviation and engineering. We have three main campuses. We have two traditional on-ground campuses in Daytona Beach and Prescott, Arizona. And then we have what we call the Worldwide Campus, which is a combination of online students and about 118 off-campus instructional sites across the globe, and about 35,000 students total. And as Bill set me up really perfectly for great theoretical discussions and ideas, and I'm going to talk a little more granularly about some of the work we've done at Riddle and some of the work we're attempting to do to help maximize the impact of the assessment work that our faculty put so much time and effort into. That really comes back to figuring out how we can link individual achievement and competencies from course-based data and then still tackling kind of the student learning outcome question from an institutional, programmatic, and student level. And again, we have some theoretical pieces in here, but a lot of it will be efforts that we've tried to start working through and the impacts that those have ultimately had. So if we really start by thinking about the impact of perspective, and I think what Bill was talking about, especially at the end, Bill and Patrice, it's a very timely tie-in to what I'm going to mention, where the perspective we're sitting at dictates so much of what we're thinking about when it comes to assessment. And in reality, I think there's sort of the program level view and the faculty level view. And what we can do with the data, what we're expected to do, what conversations we're having wrapped around it is really impacted by which approach we're taking. And it leads to a disconnect that I think offices like assessment offices, CTLEs, have to spend a lot of time working with faculty on, because our accrediting bodies are coming to them and really emphasizing program level reporting and program level outcome achievement. So for us, we're a SAC COC campus. They want to hear about programs. They're not worried necessarily about individual students. They're not worried about courses. Frankly, they're not even worried about institutional level necessarily. They want to talk about programs. But we know that for our faculty that are teaching courses, or if we're thinking about experiential learning in the broader institutional spectrum, staff members, student affairs staff members who are leading experiential learning, more holistic assessment, the areas that maybe general education or core curriculum thinks they hit on, but in reality, we have outside the classroom activities really taking the lead. We know that they're thinking about it through a more micro level. So, I still actively teach. When I'm sitting in front of my class, I'm not thinking about program learning outcomes. I'm thinking about, I have 20 or 25 students online with me. How do I feel they're doing at attaining what I'm asking them to attain or hoping they'll attain? I'm not thinking about all the levels that will roll up before it gets into more of this program level focused assessment. So it's essential that we kind of start from thinking about this framework and the way that it impacts what we're doing and what this unit disconnect really tells us. And the unit disconnect concerns me, and it's something we emphasize with faculty all the time at Riddle, because first it leads to fragmented learning. It's a lack of alignment and cohesion, whether that's courses, modules, experiences, activities within a program, where we think about the fact that students are encountering disjointed course materials and teaching methods that don't necessarily build on each other, leading to a fragmented learning experience. And I saw the question. I'll make sure I get a PDF of my slides out for everybody so you guys can have these. When I first started teaching, I was adjuncting at a four-year private liberal arts college that's since closed. And we had about 400 students in our program, and there were about 9 programs total that were taking. I'm a recovering political scientist, so it's intro to American government, political theory, comparative politics. And they're coming into the classroom and they've handed me, here's the previous person's syllabus, here's general things we want you to get. But what they left out is telling me that course was required for 9 different programs for very different reasons. I tend to skip talking about bureaucracy just because it's boring for me. And I don't like explaining how the government works because it's not always a pretty picture to sell to a bunch of 18-year-olds. But in this particular case, I had business students that were required to take it because they wanted them to be exposed to the regulatory nature of American government. And I just cut that completely from the required course that I was teaching for them, because nobody ever shared with me what the connection should be between what I was doing in that classroom and broader programmatic pieces. And at Riddle, we've had some of the same concerns historically. We have industry experts come in. We have sitting pilots, sitting engineers, sitting astronauts come in and teach in aviation or space or business. And they teach from their perspective, which is great. But if we're not explaining to them all of the things students might need to leave this course with or this experience with, we could have potential issues that we're running into. So just an important kind of fragmentation perspective. Then we have inconsistent objectives when we think about the unit disconnect. Each course can have its own set of goals and outcomes that don't necessarily align or support the overarching objectives of the degree program, leads to confusion and inconsistency for students. And let's be honest in this conversation, it leads to confusion and inconsistency for students if they have class with the good faculty who are really drilling into these outcomes and objectives as something more than a syllabus day 5-minute gloss over. But for students who are, they might find themselves sitting and asking, why am I taking this particular class? What is it bringing? How are we thinking about this more broadly? And it can also lead to siloed instruction. When I was a faculty member, I cared about what I was doing in that classroom. I wanted those students to learn. I didn't, as I said, worry about the higher level pieces or the bigger pieces or what might come next, which can lead to that siloed approach, which again isn't good programmatically. It's not good for students. All things to kind of impact. For students, this leads to potential negative impacts, obviously, confusion and frustration as they try to bring these pieces of information together and try to figure out how this course ties to this course. And we'll talk about some of the exercises we've done that really demonstrate this confusion and frustration. It can lead to an inability to synthesize knowledge. If we think about the unit disconnect, if students are viewing each of their courses as isolated occurrences and not thinking broader, I loved when in Bill and Patrice's presentation, we talked about portfolios, we talked about reflection, we talked about how do all of these things come together holistically to give us a sense of what's happening. It's hard to do if we're not giving students a framework or presenting the opportunities for that type of framework. And it can ultimately then lead to reduced mastery. I mean, if we're making it difficult for them to synthesize knowledge, we're, in some way, shape, or we're going to step further, which I think is where Bill and Patrice did such a strong job earlier, of it's not just what's happening in the classroom either. It's the experiential piece. I mean, my poster child example at Embry-Riddle right now is we have obviously the 3 campuses. We do one gen ed assessment. So we come in and we review artifacts from different courses on different campuses. And they were looking at a gen ed outcome for this year and trying to figure out how to assess it that focuses on students being able to meaningfully collaborate in teams. And apparently when they assessed it last 5 years ago, what this, I'm sorry if you guys couldn't hear me for a minute. My internet's been a little sketchy, but my bad. I didn't notice, so I'll try to catch that in the future. What I was saying though is that is a Riddle example here on general education. One of our competencies focuses on teamwork and the ability to function as strong members of the team. And from an academic perspective, when they reviewed this 5 years ago, they actually had students record team meetings and they were kind of assessing video recordings of team meetings. And were surprised by how, logical they were and how very clear cut and very neat and very professional. And it's because students are obviously, putting on a show for the camera versus how they're actually working in teams. But they can't figure out how else to measure that without just using indirect measures or asking students, what they're feeling. And this year, what we're actually going to do for the first time at Riddle is we're going to look at it as a co-curricular. And we're starting to bring in work students are doing with student organizations and student groups as part of our best measures towards this, because it gets away from this disconnect and actually lets us see where they're actually gaining the knowledge. And we'll talk about how we document that here momentarily. So we have to address it because, like I was just saying, we want this to be holistic. We want what we do with assessment at Riddle to be holistic and to look at the entire student experience. And that's not just making sure their courses are interconnected, that they support each other, that they're cohesive, but that what they're doing outside of the classroom is tying in. I mean, the experiential learning presentation, I'm sitting here taking notes because we're, for the first time in the institution's history, having a conversation about an experiential learning requirement and what that would look like. And again, the questions you're asking, how do we do that with 20,000 online students, and how do we do that with adult learners, and how do we do that with active duty military? We know that plays a role. And in fairness, on gen ed especially, I would argue there's probably things happening on the experiential learning side that are having a greater impact on student mastery of those competencies than anything that's happening in the classroom in many cases. So I think it's very, very important for us to continue checking that. We also want to make sure that we have accurate assessment, that we're aligning course content and assessments with programmatic goals, and ultimately enhancing quality. We want students to be able to integrate and apply what they're learning across different contexts. And we want to make sure that the work we're doing and the work that we're especially asking faculty to do is contributing to that, and not being done just for the sake of doing more work. So if we think about aligning teaching practices with programmatic goals as kind of a starting point for this potential conversation, we have to figure out how we align these. And this leads to CTLE, assessment, IT, all having to work together in impactful ways, especially with academic leadership, to determine how we can best reinforce the knowledge and skills that are being acquired in previous courses. This starts for us with questions like prereqs. When I got to Riddle, one of my favorite things to do at any institution is to sit down and go through the catalog and meet with faculty who tell me things like, Math 101 is required before a student can take Math 102. Makes logical sense. But it's also fair to ask the question of, why do we think that is? What data do we have? What can we show that actually demonstrates that students who don't do well in Math 101 wouldn't do well in Math 102 or vice versa? And you find out real fast that, prereqs are things that were established at some point in the curriculum 25 years ago, and nobody's thought twice about them since, and they just continue to live and live and live. They continue to roll over with every catalog year and lead to all sorts of potential headaches for students, for potential problems, all of these things. And I just saw the question come in on, the accurate assessment piece, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, but it really is through faculty conversations that we start to figure out what they think is going to work, and then we start driving the data piece to actually see what assessments seem to be capturing the data that we ultimately really want. So that's a good foreshadowing for things to come, where we'll spend a lot of our time talking, because we want it to be accurate. It doesn't make sense if it's not. Step one for us is curriculum mapping, and we've started this conversation at Riddle in my year there. Next year, the coming spring, this is going to be the real emphasis. But really using curriculum mapping at a very micro level to start figuring out what types of data we need, what types of data we want to work through, and then what types of data we want to help push to determine what's actually working. So it's definitely a piece of that. And you're right, we want to look at, we do curriculum maps with the prereq side. We want to look and make sure that student learning is making sense. There is a maturity piece to it. I mean, I saw Yark's comment, and that's 100% accurate there, that does exist with it. But we know curriculum mapping, I think everybody on this call is at least familiar with the idea of us looking at objectives or outcomes, strategies, assessments, to really present for students what they're going to experience across a program. And I'm a firm believer that, curriculum maps should be marketing tools. They should be advising tools. They should bring clarity to students as they think about what they're going to experience. And we know they've evolved. We've gone from simple course outlines to institutions like Riddle, where we're moving towards a much more dynamic, data-driven process and approach to this to really get into real-time insights, which we've especially been successful in doing with our worldwide campus. And this has tremendous potential for impact. It helps us start to see what types of students are and aren't meeting particular outcomes in particular courses, and what we might have known about them coming in that could have helped us know that ahead of time. What type of remediation can we offer? What's the disconnect between the grades they're earning and the outcome achievement? All of these things play into thinking about curriculum maps and assessment really being used for assessment as a predictor of student success. So if we think about the benefits, obviously the alignment's a key part. It helps us look and see how things fit. I can tell you that, the program I'm involved with at our worldwide campus, we've started doing this with adjuncts now, where when they come on board as part of their orientation, we show them all of the curriculum maps on campus where the course they're going to teach actually plays into the curriculum map. So they get a holistic sense of, here are the different types of students I might have. Here are the things that matter to them. Here are the things they need to be successful next. And really recognizing there that, if you're an adjunct and you just don't like teaching about the bureaucracy, here's the students that might be impacted by that in a negative way and why we'd want you to do it. It should lead to improved student learning. If we look at gaps, if we look at redundancies, if we look at areas for improvement, this should help us as long as we meaningfully act on it and meaningfully respond. And it should get us to a data-driven, data-informed approach, which at Riddle, for worldwide, we've started doing it, and on the residential campuses, it's coming as a next step to really figure out what differences are mattering. So a lot of this comes back to tracking at the individual student level. And this is an important part to speak to. It's a huge component is tracking at the individual student level. For our worldwide campus, this part's been the easy part. They use Canvas, they use structured course shells. Faculty are able to adjust and tweak courses, but in general, everybody's using the same assignments in all sections across the board. They're all in Canvas. We're working on them using Canvas outcomes to make this even easier, but we can pull individual student achievement very, very easily. On our residential campuses, where, if I'm being generous today, I'd say we're at about 60% usage, and they're sure not thinking about Canvas usage from the perspective of tracking individual students, it's a bigger ask. But to use this the most impactful way possible, we need to get faculty on board with, in some way, shape, or form, helping us track individual student learning outcome achievement at a course level so we can look over time. I mean, Bill and Patrice mentioned very clearly the use of grades. Grades are what we have, grades are what we care about. It's true, but I'm arguing we can go an even lower level into the outcome achievement and really start to see which outcomes in which courses matter, which is where prereqs come into play. If I know that course outcome 1 in Math 101 directly correlates to whether a student's likely to meet course outcome 3 in Math 102, and if they don't meet it, they're not going to meet that, now we know where the problem is. Now we know a more micro level component that we can really start to work on. And a grade is very different from assessment, and it's why we need to get faculty thinking about assessing individual students. But I also acknowledge, without technology behind to make that easy, that's a significant ask for faculty. You're now asking them to ultimately go through, issue grades for every student, but say you're teaching a 25-person class, or say you're teaching a 300-student class. And now I'm also saying, for these 2 or 3 outcomes, can you also tell me which students did and didn't meet them at an individual level, as opposed to just aggregating that and telling me? So it's a difference, but it's an important difference that I think, hopefully I can help make a case for why we try to push to doing that. So obviously, if we get to individual student learning, number one is we can move towards more personalized learning models, which I think with AI we know is a big topic of conversation and something that folks are interested in. But if we can get to more personalized learning models that we can identify individual student needs, abilities, learning styles, whatever it might be, we can best track students to be successful, hopefully in the future, in a way that doesn't mean the faculty member has to feel like they're teaching 8 different classes all at the same time based on different folks. And I think that's an important framework to kind of think through on this, is that for that individual student, we can start to know that, hey, for some student, and again, I'll use a Riddle example. Let's use physics. I talk about physics all the time, and I don't understand physics at all, which makes it a perfect conversation. Physics is paramount to being a good engineer, definitely to being a good pilot, to being a good astronaut, whatever it might be. We have certain students that need physics for different reasons. If we can get to personalized learning models and know, hey, this student's in this program and they're struggling with this particular learning outcome in this course, what's the data tell us? Is that going to be a make or break for that student? And the answer might be no for me. But for another student in a different program, that might be an absolute make or break. And by tracking at the individual student level, we can proactively start working on remediations that we can make available to the student in real time to help them gain what they need from that outcome. It also helps us avoid things, previous institutions I've worked at, and as a faculty member, I'm guilty of it. You can get a B or a C in a class and not meet an outcome potentially. Student leaves the class with a B or a C, they might think, I've done everything I need to do. I'm ready for that next class. But this might help us actually see that, you got the B or the C, but you didn't meet this outcome, and other students in your major who didn't meet this outcome tend to miss on these other 3 or 4 outcomes 4 courses later. So this is why we'd like to do something on a remediation side to just make sure you're really ready to go. This also lets us track real-time assessment. We can see what's happening while we're there. It's one of the reasons we're turning Worldwide over to Canvas Outcomes, that they can really look at the formative achievement of these learning outcomes throughout a semester, and then ultimately be able to summatively, hopefully better predict who is and isn't going to be able to meet it. And this real-time assessment at our Worldwide side led to some of the best work we've done in this space, and I can take no credit for it. It was done before I got there. But at Worldwide, 10-week 10-week courses, pretty much structured similarly across the board. It's not a ton of time, but we used to really jam-pack work in there. They were doing, lots of work every week because they wanted to show that students were busy, that students were engaged, that students were being exposed to different pieces. And they actually took the time in 2 of the Worldwide colleges to go through assignment by assignment and start looking at correlations on whether there was any differentiation in how students were performing in different case studies or different discussion pages or different tasks throughout any given week. And they were able to cut the amount of work students were completing by close to 35%, and really letting them focus in on the key assignments that were meaningfully making difference. And Enrique, I see your point about grades do not ensure learning took place, and I completely agree with that. I've yet to be successful in convincing an 18-year-old that gets an A in the class that they have not learned what they need to learn, though, or that maybe they've missed something out of that entire class. So you're absolutely right objectively, but it's how do I convince the student who earned a grade that there were still things they might want to do better on, because 5 courses later, they're going to be like, crap, I got a B, but I don't remember this at all. Or wow, I was really bad at this. And that gets into course design and conversations with faculty about why are students getting a B and not meeting this outcome. All of those conversations come to play. So it's balancing that reality that we know is kind of the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain versus what the students are perceiving is we only give them the grade. I mean, that's part, again, is why you want to get to individual student tracking, because, do we tell students in a meaningful way whether they've met course outcomes or not? At my institution, they wouldn't know that. They'd know the grade, but nobody's sitting there at the end saying, there were 5 course learning outcomes, and here are the 3 you did great on and 2 that you struggled with. We just show them the grade. So they value what we show them. And then it leads to informed decision-making. I will say to your exact point, Enrique, that, when I was at Jacksonville University, we had kind of a course and an instructor that was perfect for this conversation. He was a notoriously hard grader. He graded on a curve. He taught intro to chemistry. Students and parents despised this man because pretty much everybody ended up with a C. But from an informed decision-making perspective, what we were able to show parents and students, and we actually started doing this, again, as part of freshman orientation with parent meetings for multiple programs on campus, that getting the C was actually a better alternative than transferring it in from somewhere else that might be easier, because we could show data that looked at outcome achievement in course grades in the 300 and 400 level health science classes. And getting a C with him actually better set up a student to be successful later on, it came to grad rates, course performance, everything else, than transferring it in from somewhere else. So it should lead to better decisions. And I saw somebody made a comment about in my past life being an academic advisor. I've never been an academic advisor, and I am not the person who should be talking to 18-year-olds. But I love giving academic advisors access to data like this, because parents and students do respond when you show them that, like, look, we have data from 800 students that are like you that didn't meet this outcome or didn't get this grade, and here's what it looks like 2 years from now. It at least pauses the unhappiness, the questions, the anger in some cases over why do I have to do remediation? Why do I have to do this piece? And best question spot on what are the carrots and sticks we use? In Flagler College, where I first started in the IRIE world, probably has the best example. We found at Flagler, just looking at grades and relating grades to graduation rates, our Intro to Speech Communication course was one that was interesting. Students got an A or B in Intro to Speech Communication. Grad rates were over 70%. The students were doing exactly what we wanted. Students got a C or lower. The grad rate was in the 20s. I mean, it was a huge chasm between the two. And the first thing we meaningfully did is we got all of the faculty together who taught Intro to Speech Communication, and we kind of showed them the data and asked, tell us about this, like tell us what you think. And those faculty immediately assumed we were saying we just wanted them to give everybody A's and B's, which was the polar opposite of what we're trying to achieve. But we asked them, what causes you to get a C in Intro to Speech Communication? What is the issue? And it found out very quickly, has nothing to do with public speaking, has nothing to do with, informative speaking, debates, anything else. For you to get a C in Intro to Speech Communication, you pretty much have to fail to turn in speech notes. You don't do a speech. You don't show up for your peer speeches. It's all about, academic engagement more than academic performance. Once we learned that, what we ultimately did is students that got a C or less in the speech communication course were enrolled in a 0 credit hour, three time a semester total seminar that focused on academic engagement skills. So that just became a co-curricular requirement for them in the next semester, just to make sure that we were thinking about this and talking about this in a meaningful way. And we explained to them when we enrolled them in it that you're here because we have data that shows that grade is signifying something that we want to correct now so that you're on the right side of that graduation rate 4 or 6 years from now, not on the wrong side. We had plenty of other examples that weren't that clear cut between, different grades or different outcome achievements where we would offer remediation similar to that for students. But again, it takes work, it takes buy-in, it takes faculty being willing to have the conversation. On that speech communication example, we were lucky because it was fairly clear cut. There wasn't a lot of debate or discussion around what it was looking like. So it was possible to do that in a way that it might not always be. So if we think about the curriculum maps, this is, let's call this a historical curriculum map. When I got to Embry-Riddle, this is a lot of what we saw. In this case, it's not doing learning outcomes. It's from an aviation program, so it's mapping to accreditation criteria. But general sense of, this criteria and this course. And we sort of know what hits where and where we expect things to build and where things will be assessed. But when I got to Riddle, I realized, this doesn't give me the whole look at everything. I have the same programs across 3 campuses, and I don't know who's doing what with anything, and all of these different pieces to look at. So we've moved Riddle towards a more detailed curriculum map, and this is still in draft form because we're working through them. This is a sample. We don't have public policy at Riddle, which is why I use it. I can't offend any faculty with misgivings or misjudgments or misplacements early. But the idea of what we really want to get to with our curriculum maps is that we can go in and start to figure out both formatively and summatively what's happening. We can figure out which course outcomes are being mapped to which program outcomes through individual courses. So we have another granular layer of data. And this helps us dictate faculty conversations. For our worldwide campus, this type of mapping is incredibly easy. All of the courses use the same assignments. It's all structured. Everything's pre-built in Canvas. The residential campuses, the most interesting thing is to be able to sit down, to sit down with faculty and say, let's say you all teach microeconomics and you all believe that this course outcome using knowledge and abilities to solve a problem in any context, whether that's a good or bad program outcomes are relevant right now. Let's this outcome. What are you using to assess that in your course? And all of a sudden faculty are like, well, I use 3 questions off a multiple choice exam on the final. And another faculty members, I use a case study. I have students do independent research and write about this outcome. You end up with very different pedagogical techniques, which we encourage. We want faculty to own what they're doing in the classroom and own that piece. But then we also ask them, okay, so what are you doing to actually measure it at the end? What are you doing to prepare them? The number of times that we'll have faculty come back and say, well, we use a discussion board for the formative assessment throughout the semester, Then we get to the end of the semester and we expect them to do 4 problems on the final exam, and the discussion board somehow prepared them for this. And we talk about, is that a reasonable connection? Maybe we need to give them problems earlier on. Maybe we need to look at it in more depth. But it gives us a better sense of where to take those conversations. And then building off some of the questions that are starting to pop up in the chat when I look over at it, it leads to data-informed conversations with faculty. We can all of a sudden get more micro and say, look, we're not saying there's anything wrong with using the multiple choice exam or using the case study. But what we can see is that students who have used the case study and met the outcome, maybe they're doing better when we get down to this public policy outcome. Or maybe they're doing a lot better when they get into the capstone because it's been a higher level assignment. And we can take that data back to faculty and they can start discussing, are there ways that our students are learning this better or not? Or they might find out there's no differentiation. Whether I use multiple choice, a case study, a discussion, research paper, outcomes all look the same when we get to the program at the end. But it gives them more granularity in that information they're looking at. So I'm just going to look at the questions here real quick, because I think there's probably some really relevant ones. Yark, your point, absolutely. Institutional accountability measures. Grading's not the guarantee of learning, which is why I hope by getting to the more micro level of outcomes, we can really see what's happening there. Now, that still leads to the same question of, if faculty aren't being, I don't want to say as serious, that's the absolute wrong term, but if faculty aren't being as discriminatory in determining who is and isn't meeting outcomes, it still might not help us get there, but we'd at least have more granular data to sort of look at. Because success, in Teresa, I'm just reading your comment right now, success isn't measured by how many hoops they jump through or clock hours. We have to really pick apart these subjects and what's manageable. Yeah, absolutely, and knowledgeable. Like, what is it in the course that matters? And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I'm sitting here telling you guys to do this. I still have participation points and attendance and all the stuff that doesn't tie back to an outcome and makes the grades less meaningful. And then Teresa's question about flipped around, when students are earning C's but can indeed demonstrate an achievement of their learning, is that a conversation? 100%. Teresa, that's spot on, where how is it set up to grade that the student's meeting all of these outcomes and not getting there? And also that introduces, the even more important conversation that I was going to mention, the indirect assessment. At Riddle, faculty end of course evaluations always ask students how much progress they feel they made on each of this course student learning outcomes. What happens when faculty tell you 80% of students meet an outcome, but only 30% of students indicate that they think they've made progress on it? What's that disconnect in intentionality, or vice versa? So it all becomes essential. And then, the other thing we do with these curriculum maps to really drive home this point is with graduating seniors, and we did it with 3 programs last spring at Riddle, and we're going to expand this out because faculty are interested. We take the curriculum map at a very high level. So basically, we sit down with graduating students in focus groups, and we give them the curriculum map. We give them, here are the courses you were required to take. Here are your program learning outcomes. You tell us where you feel you were exposed to these program learning outcomes by course. And then we take that, we heat map it, and we give it back to the faculty, and we highlight where students are perceiving progress on outcomes when faculty aren't intending for students to make progress in that course necessarily, or vice versa, the areas where faculty thought they were, but we find out they weren't. So if it's just this one, for example, maybe the students come back and say, for this develop ethically defensible solutions, they don't think they got that out of public policy at all, but all of them are saying they get it out of microeconomics. And that becomes another conversation with faculty on, like, look, the way your students are perceiving learning doesn't align with how you intended it. They're saying it happened, but what assignments are happening in microeconomics? What course materials being covered that leads to this? And that becomes a difficult part. I saw the question come in on, say a college doesn't have an LMS, Liz, to your point, in the deficiencies. You don't need technology to do this, outside of, Excel in some ways. But obviously it's something that, the less tech focused it is, the more difficult it gets. But for programs especially, I think one of the ways to start, and it's what we did at JU, because we did not have an LMS that would accomplish or help us with this. We didn't have a strong assessment management system when I got there. We picked some of our smaller programs, especially in graduate studies, And we would sit with faculty where they'd cap at, 20 incoming students a year. And we'd actually kind of manually fill these out student by student. So if they were only bringing in 20 students, we'd work with the grad chairs to actually create Excel-based workbooks that were individual student tabs where they could go in and say, did this student meet it or not, and then walk through that particular piece. So it is a huge component. And I just saw, what came in on the grading from Rapali. Grading is essential, but I don't think this is this or that. I think both of these things need to be accomplished, but I think the grading becomes more understandable if I also know from an outcome achievement side what I've accomplished and how that's translated into the grade. Now, the part that I want to make sure we have time for, and I don't want to open this up to discussion and hear everybody's thoughts and everything that goes with it. How do we implement this? How do we do the data piece? How do we do these pieces that we've kind of started looking at? Data types and collection. Obviously, we get all sorts, academic performance, we get attendance records. We can go even broader. And this is where we get into what Bill and Patrice were talking about. This can include the co-curricular. This can include behavioral pieces. If you have a data lake, you can not just look at course outcomes, but we can also see what groups are they in? What events did they attend? All of these different pieces and demographics can be brought together to help us figure out where we will anticipate potential problems. And ultimately, that can lead to things that can be visualized. Again, the goal at Riddle, we're not there yet. We're just getting going fully into this. But especially for our worldwide campus, let a student come in and say, I'm an active duty military member. I'm taking this program and I'm going to take one course every term. Let's see what the average looks like for students where they're going to struggle or not struggle across outcomes based on knowing 3 or 4 simple factors about it. Give students more information going in. This is a course that's really going to matter. Not that they all don't, but this is one that if I don't get it right, I'm going to struggle somewhere else. So it opens up that opportunity. It does help us with instructor effectiveness. And I want to be clear, we are not using the assessment in a punitive way in any way, shape, or form with this. But our worldwide faculty and our worldwide deans have access to dashboards that do bring together outcome achievement measures based on things in Canvas, and then end of course evaluations, just to figure out which faculty are being most effective in students showing the learning and feeling that they're perceiving learning. And we use that to figure out which faculty should we be partnering with to lead professional development to help other faculty get good at what they're doing. So the conversations you get to ultimately end up having would be, I'm not going to use myself because I don't think I get chosen for this stuff in the American government courses, but I'm just like, say that Yarrick's teaching a course, and they might look and say like, wow, he's got students who are perceiving that they're making progress, they're learning from the course, and his outcomes show they're actually doing it. But some of his colleagues are struggling on this. How can we get him in front of his colleagues in his own department or others to talk through how he does that, things he's trying in the classroom? What are the tips and tidbits that can really, really bring that forward? At JU, we did this, and I'll be honest, at JU in some programs, we did open up some conversations. It wasn't punitive, but we did open up conversations on what are the courses where adjunct faculty aren't as strong as our full-time faculty based on performance later on. What are the courses where somebody just doesn't seem to resonate with intro students, but they're great in 300 and 400 level up level courses? We had an example faculty member, and no surprise at JU with the example I gave earlier, chemistry faculty member, who was great with the intro courses compared to our friend who graded on the bell curve and people didn't necessarily love. And we ultimately had a conversation with them on, we'd really like you to teach more intros, even though that's in some ways not fair to you to say you're going to teach a bunch of intro. What can we do to make this, something you'd want to do? And the response was they would teach 3 intros a semester as long as their 4th course was always a low cap special topics. So they were, we were willing to kind of work through ways to bring that to the best part and help them, as Yark just put in the chat, improve their craft and really figure out ways they could do better by hearing from their peers while still giving them complete control over what they were doing in the classroom. We weren't telling them to change their pedagogy. We were trying to put them in places where they were more likely to be successful. Obviously, we know, as we said, positive relationships between instructors and students help. Trust, respect, open communication all play a role in that. The methodologies and sharing those out, and then focusing it on continuous improvement, having faculty have access to feedback. Jeremy, I saw your quote about wanting to see the dashboards. I can't show the dashboards live because it really gets into some faculty data, but I will work on getting some screenshots that I can include with my slides so they can go out that takes away some names and lets people start to get a sense of how we're looking at these things. So I can meet in the middle as best as possible. And I can't filter to just mine, or I'd show you just mine. I'm not really embarrassed or concerned. This also helps with course scheduling. We start to figure out which courses, which outcomes matter where, and how it ties to outcomes. Is there ordering? Is there an order that makes sense? Are there prereqs? We introduced at JU a ton of prereqs that didn't exist previously because when we started looking at the data this way, even though there wasn't an existing prereq, faculty are like, well, the outcome clearly shows that if they don't meet that outcome in that course, they have next to no chance of meeting it in this course. So that sure feels like a prereq. So we had lots of opportunities here. And that came into everything from sequencing, suggested sequencing. If there weren't prereqs, we use this to. I saw somebody earlier asked about Helio Campus. We're a Civitas shop at Riddle, but same idea of like what data can we look at and how can we get to a micro level of outcomes to figure out which courses should tie in. So what makes the most sense? And if it doesn't make sense, why is there a prereq there? All of those types of conversations. The timing, student learning trajectories, durations, frequencies. We spent a lot of time at JU looking at frequencies in our language courses because we had a serious conversation about going to a Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday schedule. So 4 days a week, every course would be the longer block. But when we looked at the data, we realized our language students who did the 2-day-a-week block struggled with higher level learning outcomes in later courses more than our students who had the 3-day-a-week, less time, more frequent conversations, and that killed that entire trajectory. We were like, okay, if it's going to impact student learning, we don't get the benefits from this in the same way. And then algorithms. What can we put in to actually help schedule algorithms that balance rigor, workload, student well-being? And this gets into, the bad combinations, the toxic combinations, which we know there's lots of issues and concerns with, but are there just combos that certain students in certain programs shouldn't be taking all at the same time? What are they? How do we make sure students aren't finding themselves in that trap? How are we making sure advisors know that they shouldn't be falling into that trap? And then the remediation. The remediation is my favorite part of this. If we know there's outcomes problems, we know there's a disconnect in some way, shape, or form between grades and outcomes potentially, what can we design? For our online students, it's great because they cannot meet the outcome in real time formatively, and we can turn on the remediation and they don't know any different. It gets added to the next module as one extra thing for them to look at or consider or do. But we wanted to figure out what the gaps are. And then we needed to figure out, as somebody mentioned, the carrots and the sticks. What are the remediation plans? Is it tutoring? Is it adaptive learning? Is it SI models? It helped us figure out which courses do we want to make sure we have peer tutors enrolled in so they can observe in real time and learn in real time. How do we make that part palatable and useful? And then to the questions about how do you do it without technology, what's the scalable piece here? What's the scalable implementation? How do we make this bigger? And at Riddle, it's tough because if I think about 3 campuses, let's say 80 programs per campus, and I want to do focus groups with some graduating seniors, I have to have a ton of people who are capable of sitting down with graduating seniors, talking to them about curriculum maps, talking to them about where they're learning things and where they're not, and being willing to spend that time. And that's a big ask of time. Then it comes to the interconnectedness. I only have a few slides left, and then we'll get to the conversation. We want to integrate this. The curriculum mapping, the student tracking, the instructor evaluation, the remediation design, they all come together. And I didn't mention it on the curriculum mapping, but going back to Bill's point, we can easily do curriculum mapping for co-curricular things as well, experiential learning. Where do they fit in? Part of what we're doing right now for the Gen Ed assessment for this year on teamwork is we have that floating around all 3 campuses, student affairs offices with the map for that outcome, saying what events, what activities, what trainings, what things do you do where students might demonstrate this? And that will become part of a holistic student curriculum map. the continuous improvement cycle. It's all about bringing this together. It's all about looking at it. And most importantly, I mean, I saw the comment that I think it was Enrique who put it in, the goal is always continuous improvement. We have to give them time to actually think about this. When we get into outcome level data like this, we're throwing a huge amount of data at faculty. And they have to have time to meaningfully think about what it means. It can't just be done in a 2-week, one meeting. They need to reflect on, we're asking them to reflect on how they've designed programs, how they teach courses, how students perceive it. All of these things take time and barriers to kind of break through. And then align it obviously with the educational goals and objectives that we have more broadly. How do we do it? Your institution needs to commit to it. You guys have got to agree that this is something you care about. And I really appreciated Amanda's comment on, outcome sequencing playing a role in this. That's the type of commitment you need. If people can agree that, the outcomes can help us think about this, that's the biggest hurdle. Then it's starting to actually look at that data and look at those courses and look at the assignments and figure out what's mattering and not. We have to offer professional development on it. And it's hard because it's varied audiences. The way I talk to curriculum mapping with some faculty on campus is we start from square one like they've never heard of it. Very different from how I talk to folks who've been doing it for years. And sometimes you end up with all of those people in the room at the same time, and trying to hit that right tenor and hitting that right tone that allows you to have that impact is important. Then you have to communicate. There have to be feedback loops. There has to be transparency in this. As you talk about the dashboards and we talk about faculty and having all of this stuff tied together, there has to be some element of transparency so people know what everybody's looking at. And that's a hurdle to get past. And it's why we don't bring the entire course evaluation over in any way, shape, or form. It's the very selected sort of vanilla questions that faculty won't get up on ends or up in arms about. So important that we always talk about it and keep that feedback loop going. And there's obviously an ethical piece here, an ethical consideration. Data privacy and security. You have to be thinking about this here. Comes back to controls, who can see what. To what level can they see it? Do they need to see student names? Transparently, on most of the work I try to get to on dashboards, we don't necessarily even care about the student name. We're using identifiers because we just want to look at trends. We don't need to see that person. I mentioned the grad certificate example, though. I mean, there we were looking at individual students, but in the same time, I'd argue in a program with only 20 students, the instructors already know who these students are and what they're doing and not doing. So it's figuring out institutionally what you can and can't do. Letting students know. I've shared with this group before, I'm big on telling students exactly what we're doing with this type of data and why we're doing it. I think it's helpful. I think it's beneficial. It gets them asking questions. At JU, where I had, one new student orientation, I would go out there and I would tell them, here's all the data we're going to collect. Here's how we're going to use it. Here's the types of things we might show you. We're doing this for your benefit. We're doing this to get you out of here and into the career you want in the best way possible. But trying to make sure we're clear on that, and then recognizing the biases and fairnesses that we might have. But again, in general, I think it just comes back to what Teresa said. Don't have it be mysterious. Why not tell students this? I love when faculty are like, "Can I tell students the course outcomes and then which ones, if students don't meet it, they should." I was like, "Please tell them. If it gets them to pay more attention to that and take it seriously, that's a win for everybody. It's a win for you in that class. That's a win for the person who teaches the student 4 classes from now. It's good for everybody." And then leveraging this, obviously collecting and integrating, it's the hard point. You guys have already brought up some of the points. If you don't have a strong LMS, if you don't have visualization tools or people to do these things, it is difficult, but you can start small and still have an impact. You also don't have to start with everything. I mean, maybe it's something where the 2 or 3 courses that are really the courses. Dig into those first. Don't worry about the 15 other courses on day one necessarily. Focus where you might have even a gut feeling that this is going to be one that matters and see how that plays out. Using it for predictive modeling, obviously this can feed all kinds of predictive models. Then the visualizations and the storytelling are pretty clear. And then it's all culture. We got to have people ready to know how to use this. We need the data literacy. We need collaboration. We need folks to talk. This brings advisors in. This brings different groups in. And then the continuous improvement mindset that Enrique has been good at bringing into the chat. It's got to be there and it's got to survive there. So I am happy to take questions. I saw Bree just put one in. When do you solicit informed consent from students for assessment? Bree, I will be honest. Riddle and JU, I talk about informed consent. This isn't one where we're necessarily doing signed informed consent statements, since it's all institutional data. It's much more about a culture where we're informing students that we're doing this. I can say at JU, they heard about it every time they met with an advisor to schedule for the next semester, and they'd remind them that we're collecting this data and this is what it looks like. So it's just all about, again, not having it be mysterious to them where some of these decisions are coming from. So I just want to be clear on that, we're not getting signed informed consent things like they're doing a survey or anything. Go ahead, Enrique. Saw your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Miller. This is wonderful. A question I had about the collection of data. Do faculty have access to the data, or do faculty then have to go to your institutional research office or database office? How does that work?
Yeah, so and I'll use worldwide for now because it's where it's the most established and pre-built, and our Office of Academic Innovation is really taking leadership there. Deans and associate deans have access to the colleges. Department chairs have access to their departments. Faculty see their own. But I would say more than half of the departments, the individual faculty have access to the whole department, where the departments have discussed and talked about it so they can see the data on their own without having to go through somebody to get it. So if you talk to one faculty member on our campus, they might say they have total access to their entire area. Another might say they haven't seen that, but they have the ability to sit and go through it. And that's one that's still being worked out. The residential campuses, I think that will be even thornier, just because the data is not as automated for them when we first head down this path in the near future. I think that I hope that addresses it. It's a mixed bag to be.
Mixed bag. And the second question I had was then does your dashboards, do they track students' progression, learning?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so the dashboards are geared at, I mean, ultimately, what the end vision is, and again, we are not there yet, but we are quickly getting there, thankfully. I want to know, here's a student transcript, here's the grades in the courses. I want something similar that looks at the course learning outcomes that mapped to something. So again, it's not every course learning outcomes, it's what goes into the program outcome. But show me student progress by student so I can start aggregating that, and that's where you can figure out these students that struggle in this outcome in this course also are struggling here, but it's really meant to be looking at that trajectory over their time with us, the same way we've historically looked at grades.
Thank you.
I saw a question about team structure. I'm very blessed. Just on the continuous improvement side, we have 10 total, including me. We have an IR office. Worldwide has an academic innovation office, so we have good support in place, which plays a role. Now, if you're using something like Helio Campus or Civitas, and you can get this data in a meaningful way, odds are they can bring it into models for you, which helps with that. But that's tough. And Chad, you asked the perfect follow-up question of the Office of One. I really think on the Office of One side, it's picking the programs or picking the courses where you have the greatest impact to show what this can do, and starting small and then using, success in showing different pieces to be able to hopefully start building some of that out. Because that's 100% as a smaller office. I have always been in small offices until I got to Riddle, so that's been an adjustment for me. But I think even with one person, you can start looking at smaller programs and being able to really think through, what's the course people always say they get stuck on, and what can we track on that? And does it matter for different students? Is there any component of that course that's really what matters or not? So all of those things I think become possible, but it's building blocks. I view it as the same as if you don't have the strong tech side or you don't have the LMS that might make it easier. Really look for some potential impactful areas and take advantage of those. Other questions or thoughts? Like I said, this stuff I'm happy to talk about whenever with whoever. Incredibly passionate about it. My dream vision is, 5 years from now, we are able to tell that, a student regardless of the grade they get in the course, didn't meet this one outcome, and I now have a sense of probabilities for what they'll be doing 2, 3, 5, 10 courses later. And we're able to think about remediations that help them stay on track. And we're showing it to industry advisor boards and figuring out where there's a disconnect. So all of those different things. And again, it's all about skills and competencies. Where can we track those skills and competencies, and how does it correlate up? And anybody who wants to get a hold of me, sorry, I forgot I didn't get to the last, I didn't pull to the email slide. Easiest way to get me is email, will.miller@erau.edu. I'm normally very fast on responding to emails. As soon as I logged in, I saw Bree was here, and I owe her an email from like 2 weeks ago. That's not my norm. So I promise I won't let that happen to anybody else who contacts me.